Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt, and I appreciate your patience. It looks like it is working correctly this time. So, you may have noticed the number of times in the gospel story when Jesus did something remarkable, a healing or turning water to wine, for example, and then he would tell people not to say anything about it. Scholars call this the Messianic secret, and they believe that the people of Israel had all sorts of expectations for who and what the Messiah would be, and those were not the kind of Messiah Jesus came to be. Instead, Jesus wanted to fill the term Messiah with the meaning he did come to bring. It is always a powerful thing to note that in the Gospel of Mark, the only time Jesus is called the Son of God and it isn't silenced is when the Roman centurion calls Jesus the Son of God as Jesus hangs dead on the cross. On that cross, Jesus has made clear what it means to be the Messiah. But getting there must have been distressing indeed. This week, we've been looking at the emotions the gospel writers describe Jesus having. That's not always something we think about often. Our normal image of Jesus is so serene and calm and in control. He's that kind of presence. But in this week, we have seen story after story where Jesus expressed compassion and care, sorrow and joy, along with frustration and anger. Today, we move to perhaps the only emotion we might have expected Jesus to express: distress. Jesus is described as distressed in two Gospels, and both of them relate to events right before his arrest and crucifixion. That makes sense to us. If we knew that we were going to suffer and die like that, I suspect we might be a bit distressed as well. Jesus did know what was going to happen. The first instance is found in the 12th chapter of John. It's an unusual story where Palm Sunday has happened, and then some Greeks came to see Jesus. When that's over, you get the idea that Jesus is speaking to his disciples, but it turns out he's talking to a crowd who has come to the Passover festival. And Jesus' words are most striking. Now my soul is troubled. Then Jesus begins to pray, and that might be something for us right there in our own times of distress. In times of distress, Jesus models that we should turn to prayer. In his prayer, Jesus asks if he should seek to be saved from this hour. In other words, from his impending crucifixion. Then he says, "No, this is the reason I came." He wraps it up by saying, "Father, glorify your name." And a voice from heaven booms out, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." How reassuring that must have been for Jesus, especially with what followed. Just a few verses later, Jesus leaves the crowd who expresses their confusion about Jesus, and John tells us, although he had performed so many signs in their presence, they did not believe in him. How distressing that must have been to Jesus to think that his 3 years of ministry hadn't changed much at all. We are a stubborn and stiff-necked people. No wonder Jesus spent so much time in prayer and leaned on the assurance he found in it. In Mark 14, the issue is really at hand. By this time in Mark's Gospel, the Last Supper has been completed, and Jesus and his disciples go out to the Garden of Gethsemane in order for Jesus to pray. Mark tells us, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. Again, Jesus knew what was about to happen, how he would suffer and die, and any of us would be distressed and agitated in that situation too. And maybe that's something we need to understand from this whole week of looking at Jesus' emotions. Jesus was one of us. Jesus felt what we feel. Jesus really was God become one of us. And that means so much for Jesus sharing his victory over sin and death with us. But it also means that God understands what it means to be us, how we feel, our struggles, and our fears. God has felt those in Jesus. God understands, and God is with us in the midst of them. We are not left on our own. In the midst of our struggles, God is with us. Sometimes I find myself with someone in grief or distress, and they say something like, "I shouldn't be feeling this way." I usually respond, "But you do feel this way, and it's okay." I think God gave us our emotions, and He expects us to use them. Emotions are a part of our lives. Jesus had them too. In all of them, know that God understands. Know that God is with us. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.